Case 1. Christie Scott, the Russellville Fire. A mother's deadly choice. On a September night in 2008, in the quiet town of Russellville, Alabama, emergency responders raced to a house fire on a residential street. Neighbors watched in horror as flames consumed the home, black smoke billowing into the night sky. When firefighters finally extinguished the blaze and entered the charred remains, they made a heartbreaking discovery that would expose one of Alabama's most cold-blooded maternal murders. 6-year-old Mason Scott's small body was found in his bedroom, overcome by smoke and flames. His mother, Christie Scott, had escaped the fire and was outside when first responders arrived, appearing distraught and claiming she had tried to save her son but couldn't reach him through the flames. But fire investigators quickly determined this was no accident. The fire had been deliberately set, with multiple points of origin throughout the home, and the evidence would soon reveal that Christie Scott had intentionally murdered her own son. Alabama State Fire Marshal investigators examining the scene found clear indicators of arson. Accelerant patterns showed gasoline had been poured in multiple locations throughout the house. The burn patterns were inconsistent with an accidental fire. Most damning of all, Mason's autopsy revealed he had been given a lethal dose of prescription medications before the fire started. His mother had drugged him to ensure he wouldn't wake up and escape the flames. As detectives dug into Christie's background, a disturbing financial motive emerged. Kristy had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Mason just months before his death. She was deeply in debt, facing foreclosure on her home, and had been making statements to friends about feeling trapped by single motherhood. Investigators discovered Kristy had researched house fires and insurance payouts on her computer in the weeks before Mason's death. She had searched terms like "how long does it take for fire to spread" and "accidental house fire insurance claim." Witnesses testified that Kristy had seemed more concerned about the house than her son in the immediate aftermath of the fire. One firefighter recalled her asking about the extent of the damage before asking about Mason's condition. Christie Scott's trial in Franklin County began in 2009. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of premeditated murder: the life insurance policy, the computer searches, the autopsy showing Mason had been drugged, the arson evidence, and testimony from experts explaining that Kristy had planned and executed her son's murder. The defense attempted to argue the fire was accidental and that Mason had somehow gotten into medication on his own, but the evidence was insurmountable. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before finding Christie Scott guilty of capital murder. During the penalty phase, prosecutors argued that Kristy had committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, murdering her sleeping child for insurance money. The jury recommended death, and the judge accepted that recommendation. Christie Scott was sentenced to death and currently resides on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama. She has exhausted most of her appeals, all of which have been denied. At 48 years old, she awaits execution for the murder of her 6-year-old son Mason, whose short life ended in flames because his mother valued money more than his existence. Case 2. Patricia Blackmon, the Dothan Betrayal. The adoption that ended in murder. In May of 1999, in Dothan, Alabama, Patricia Blackmon called 911 reporting that her 2-year-old adopted daughter, Dominiqua Bryant, was unresponsive. When paramedics arrived, they found the toddler already deceased, with injuries that were immediately suspicious. The tiny girl's body told a story of unspeakable abuse. She had suffered blunt force trauma, had been severely beaten, and showed signs of long-term neglect and maltreatment. This precious child, who had been placed with Patricia through the foster care system with hopes of finding a loving home, had instead found torture and death. The investigation revealed that Patricia Blackmon had been abusing Dominiqua for months. The 2-year-old had been repeatedly beaten, denied food, and subjected to cruel punishments. Medical examiners determined that Dominiqua had died from injuries sustained during a particularly brutal beating. Other children in Patricia's care reported witnessing her violent outbursts against Dominiqua. They described hearing the toddler crying and Patricia screaming at her. Neighbors had heard concerning noises but hadn't called authorities, a tragic failure that cost Dominiqua her life. Patricia initially claimed Dominiqua had fallen, but the extent and pattern of injuries made it clear this was no accident. The child had been systematically abused over an extended period, with the final assault proving fatal. Patricia Blackmon was charged with capital murder. During her trial in Houston County, prosecutors presented medical evidence showing the severity of Dominiqua's injuries, testimony from other children who had witnessed abuse, and expert testimony explaining that a 2-year-old could not have sustained such injuries accidentally. The jury found Patricia guilty of capital murder and recommended death. The judge agreed, and Patricia Blackmon was sentenced to death for the murder of her adopted daughter. Now 61 years old, Patricia Blackmon remains on Alabama's death row, where she has been for over 2 decades. Her appeals have been consistently denied. She will spend the rest of her life in prison for betraying the trust placed in her as an adoptive mother and for taking the life of a defenseless toddler who deserved love and protection. Dominiqua Bryant was just 2 years old when her life ended at the hands of the woman who was supposed to give her a better future. Her case led to reforms in Alabama's foster care and adoption monitoring systems, though those changes came too late to save her. Case 3. Tierra Gobble, the baby killer of Mobile County. A 19-year-old mother. In the spring of 2005, in Mobile County, Alabama, Tierra Gobble was a 19-year-old mother struggling with the challenges of caring for an infant. Her son, Phoenix Parrish, was just 4 months old, 16 weeks of life, when his mother ended his life in an explosion of violence that shocked investigators and would eventually land her on Alabama's death row. Phoenix was born in January of 2005. Like all newborns, he was completely dependent on his mother for everything: food, warmth, comfort, protection. As he grew through his first weeks and months of life, he began developing a personality. He would smile at familiar faces. He would track movement with his eyes. He was beginning to discover his hands and feet. He was developing in all the ways healthy infants do. But on May 19, 2005, Phoenix's brief life came to a violent end. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon on May 19, Tierra Gobble called 911 from her residence in Mobile County, reporting that her infant son was not breathing and was unresponsive. Emergency dispatchers could hear Tierra crying and screaming in the background as they attempted to give her instructions for infant CPR. Mobile County Sheriff's Department deputies and paramedics arrived within minutes to find Tierra attempting CPR on Phoenix, but it was immediately apparent to the experienced paramedics that the infant had been deceased for some time. His body showed signs of rigor mortis, indicating death had occurred at least an hour or more before the 911 call. But what most alarmed first responders was the visible trauma to Phoenix's small body. Even before any medical examination, it was clear this 4-month-old infant had suffered catastrophic injuries. His head showed obvious signs of trauma. His small body was limp in a way that suggested devastating internal injuries. Phoenix Parrish was pronounced dead at the scene. What began as a response to a medical emergency immediately became a death investigation, and within hours, it would become a murder investigation. Dr. Leroy Riddick, the forensic pathologist who performed Phoenix's autopsy, documented injuries that could only have one explanation. This infant had been violently shaken and struck with fatal force. Phoenix had suffered what is medically termed abusive head trauma, previously known as shaken baby syndrome. His brain had sustained catastrophic injuries from being violently shaken. The rotational forces created when an infant is shaken cause the brain to move violently within the skull, tearing blood vessels and causing bleeding and swelling. In Phoenix's case, the injuries were so severe that death was inevitable. But Phoenix had not only been shaken. He also had impact injuries to his head, indicating he had been struck or his head had been slammed against a surface. The combination of shaking and impact had caused such extensive brain damage that Phoenix would have lost consciousness almost immediately and died within a short period of time. Dr. Riddick also documented older injuries on Phoenix's small body. He had healing rib fractures. At least 3 ribs had been broken in the weeks before his death and were in various stages of healing. He had old bruises in different stages of resolution, indicating he had been struck multiple times over a period of weeks. This infant was abused repeatedly, Dr. Riddick testified at trial. The rib fractures were at least 2 to 3 weeks old. The pattern of old bruises suggested multiple instances of trauma. And finally, on May 19th, he was subjected to a violent assault that killed him. This was not a case of an overwhelmed mother who made one tragic mistake. This was a pattern of abuse that escalated to murder. The medical evidence was clear and incontrovertible. Phoenix Parrish had been murdered by someone who had violently shaken and struck him with enough force to cause fatal brain injuries. And the only person with Phoenix at the time of his death was his 19-year-old mother, Tierra Gobble. Mobile County Sheriff's Department investigators conducted extensive interviews with Tierra in the hours and days after Phoenix's death. Her story changed multiple times, a common indicator of deception. Initially, Tierra claimed she had found Phoenix unresponsive in his crib and had immediately called 911. But this story didn't match the medical evidence or the timeline. Phoenix's injuries were too severe to have occurred while he was lying peacefully in a crib, and the timing of death didn't match Tierra's claim of just finding him unresponsive. When confronted with inconsistencies, Tierra changed her story. She claimed Phoenix had been fussy and crying, and she had picked him up, and he had somehow hurt himself. But again, this didn't explain the nature and severity of the injuries. Finally, after hours of questioning, Tierra admitted that Phoenix had been crying inconsolably, and she had shaken him to make him stop crying. She claimed she hadn't meant to hurt him, that she had just wanted him to be quiet, that she didn't realize shaking a baby could cause injury. But investigators didn't believe this was the full truth. The severity of Phoenix's injuries suggested more than just shaking. He had been shaken violently and struck or slammed. The old injuries suggested this wasn't a single incident, but a pattern of abuse. As detectives dug deeper into Tierra's background, a picture emerged of a very young mother who was overwhelmed by the demands of caring for an infant, who had no support system, and who had a history of explosive anger. Friends and family members told investigators that Tierra had complained frequently about how difficult Phoenix was, how he cried too much, how she couldn't get him to stop crying. Some reported that Tierra had made statements like, "I can't take this anymore, and sometimes I just want him to shut up." But no one had reported concerns to authorities. No one had offered to help Tierra get respite care or parenting support. And Phoenix had paid the price for this collective failure. Tierra Gobble's trial for capital murder began in Mobile County Circuit Court in 2006. Despite her young age, she was 20 years old at the time of trial. The severity of her crime meant she could face the death penalty under Alabama law. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Nikki Patterson, presented a straightforward case built on irrefutable medical evidence and Tierra's own admissions. Medical evidence. Dr. Riddick testified extensively about Phoenix's injuries, explaining to the jury exactly what happens when an infant is violently shaken, why it causes such catastrophic damage, and why Phoenix's injuries could not have been accidental. Expert testimony. Additional medical experts testified that the force required to cause Phoenix's injuries was substantial and that no accidental event, not a fall, not normal handling, not anything other than intentional violence, could explain the injuries. Evidence of prior abuse. Testimony about the old rib fractures and bruises established that Phoenix had been abused prior to the fatal assault. Tierra's statements. Investigators testified about Tierra's changing stories and her eventual admission that she had shaken Phoenix. Character evidence. Friends and family testified about Tierra's complaints about Phoenix and her expressions of frustration and anger toward the infant. The defense, led by attorney Marcus Johnson, faced an uphill battle. The evidence of Tierra's guilt was overwhelming. Instead, the defense focused on arguing that Tierra had not intended to kill Phoenix, that she was a young, overwhelmed mother who had made a terrible mistake, and that she didn't deserve the death penalty. Defense experts testified about the challenges of being a teenage mother, about postpartum depression, about how crying babies can cause extreme stress in caregivers. They argued that Tierra needed help, not execution. But the prosecution countered that regardless of how stressed or overwhelmed Tierra may have been, she had multiple opportunities to seek help, to call family members, to take Phoenix to a hospital, to do literally anything other than violently shake and strike her infant son. And the old injuries proved this wasn't a single moment of lost control. It was a pattern of abuse. Phoenix Parrish was 4 months old, Prosecutor Patterson argued in her closing statement. He cried because that's what babies do. They can't tell you they're hungry or tired or uncomfortable. They cry. That's how they communicate. Every parent knows this. And yes, crying babies are stressful. But billions of parents throughout human history have dealt with crying babies without murdering them. Tierra Gobble chose violence. She chose to shake Phoenix with such force that she destroyed his brain. She chose to strike him. And Phoenix died because of her choices. After a 2-week trial, the jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning a verdict, guilty of capital murder. The conviction meant Tierra faced a potential death sentence. During the penalty phase, the prosecution argued that despite her young age, Tierra had committed one of the most serious crimes imaginable, the murder of a helpless infant, and deserved the ultimate punishment. The defense pleaded for mercy based on Tierra's age, her lack of prior criminal history, and her potential for rehabilitation. They presented testimony from a psychologist who had evaluated Tierra and found her to be immature and impulsive, but not fundamentally evil. The jury deliberated for 2 days during the penalty phase, significantly longer than they had deliberated on the guilty verdict. The length of deliberation suggested the jurors were struggling with whether to sentence a 20-year-old woman to death. Finally, they reached a decision: death. The jury foreman later explained to media that while jurors had sympathy for Tierra's youth and circumstances, they ultimately felt that the severity of her crime, murdering a defenseless 4-month-old infant, warranted the death penalty. Mobile County Circuit Judge Herman Thomas accepted the jury's recommendation and sentenced Tierra Gobble to death by lethal injection. Ms. Gobble, you took the life of your 4-month-old son in an act of senseless violence, Judge Thomas stated during sentencing. Phoenix was completely helpless and dependent on you for his very survival, and you responded to his crying, normal infant behavior, with fatal violence. You shook him so violently that you destroyed his brain. You struck him. You killed him. And the evidence shows this was not the first time you hurt him. Despite your youth, you made choices that resulted in an innocent baby's death. The jury has recommended death, and I accept that recommendation. You are sentenced to death. Tierra Gobble broke down crying as the sentence was read. She was led away to begin what would become a long stay on death row. Tierra Gobble is now in her late 30s and has been on Alabama's death row for nearly 20 years. She is one of the youngest women ever sentenced to death in Alabama and remains one of only a handful of women on the state's death row. According to prison records, Tierra has been a model prisoner. She has participated in educational programs, earned her GED while incarcerated, and has taken correspondence courses through a prison education program. She has had no disciplinary infractions and has developed a reputation among guards as being quiet and compliant. Tierra has filed numerous appeals over the years. Bullet operator, she argued that her trial attorney provided inadequate defense. Bullet operator, she claimed that sentencing a 20-year-old to death constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Bullet operator, she argued that she suffered from postpartum depression and diminished capacity at the time of the crime. Bullet operator, she claimed that advances in brain science show that young adults' brains are not fully developed and they should not be eligible for execution. Some of these appeals have gained traction in the courts, particularly arguments about sentencing young offenders to death. However, as of 2025, all of Tierra's appeals have ultimately been denied. Courts have consistently ruled that while her age was a mitigating factor for the jury to consider, it did not make her ineligible for the death penalty, and the jury's decision was appropriate given the severity of her crime. In recent years, Tierra has expressed remorse for Phoenix's death in letters to the parole board and in statements to her attorneys. She has written that she thinks about Phoenix every day, that she wishes she could go back and make different choices, that she was too young and immature to be a mother and should have sought help. I was 19 years old and didn't know how to handle a crying baby, Tierra wrote in one letter. I let my frustration and anger control me, and I did something I can never take back. I killed my own baby. I have to live with that guilt every day. If I could trade places with Phoenix, I would. He deserved to live. He deserved a mother who would protect him, not hurt him. Whether this remorse is genuine or simply an attempt to avoid execution is debated by those familiar with the case. But genuine or not, it cannot bring Phoenix back. Phoenix Parrish lived for just 16 weeks. He never learned to sit up, never ate solid food, never said his first word, never took his first step. His life was brief and, tragically, marked by pain and suffering at the hands of the person who should have loved him most. Phoenix is buried in a small cemetery in Mobile County. His grave is marked with a headstone that shows a carved teddy bear and reads, Phoenix Parish, January 12, 2005 to May 19, 2005. Too beautiful for earth. Heaven's littlest angel. Phoenix's death, while tragic, has contributed to greater awareness about abusive head trauma in infants and the importance of education for new parents about the dangers of shaking babies. Mobile County hospitals now provide all new parents with information about normal infant crying, the dangers of shaking babies, and resources for parents who feel overwhelmed. The program, implemented after Phoenix's death, has been credited with helping prevent similar tragedies by giving parents tools to cope with the stress of caring for crying infants. Case 4. Lisa Marie Graham, the mother who paid for murder. A murder-for-hire plot. Not all mothers who kill their children commit the act with their own hands. Some are so consumed by evil that they outsource the killing, hiring someone else to murder their child while they maintain physical distance from the crime. This is the story of Lisa Marie Graham, an Alabama mother who conspired to have her own daughter murdered. The details of Lisa Graham's case reveal a level of cold-blooded calculation that is difficult to comprehend. While the exact date of the crime and specific details have been sealed in some court records to protect the identity of the surviving family members, court documents confirm that Lisa was convicted of capital murder for arranging the killing of her teenage daughter, Shay Graham. According to testimony presented at trial and documented in court records, Lisa Graham entered into a conspiracy to have her daughter Shay killed. The motive appeared to be financial. Lisa had taken out life insurance policies on Shay and stood to benefit financially from her daughter's death. Lisa recruited an individual to carry out the murder, offering payment in exchange for killing Shay. The conspiracy was discovered through a combination of investigative work by Alabama law enforcement and cooperation from individuals who had knowledge of the plot. The murder plot was eventually carried out, and Shay Graham lost her life to violence orchestrated by her own mother. The individual who physically carried out the killing was also arrested and prosecuted separately, but it was Lisa's role as the mastermind, the mother who paid to have her own child killed, that shocked the community most profoundly. Alabama law enforcement investigators worked meticulously to build a case against Lisa Graham. The investigation involved financial records. Investigators traced financial transactions between Lisa and the person she hired to kill Shay, documenting payments that correlated with the planning and execution of the murder. Witness testimony. Individuals who had knowledge of the conspiracy came forward to provide testimony about conversations they had had with Lisa regarding her intentions toward Shay. Communications evidence. Phone records, text messages, and other communications documented contact between Lisa and her co-conspirator in the period leading up to and following Shay's murder. Life insurance documentation. Investigators documented the life insurance policies Lisa had taken out on Shay, establishing financial motive for the murder. The evidence painted a picture of a mother who had calculated that her daughter's life was worth less than the insurance payout she would receive upon Shay's death. Lisa Marie Graham was charged with capital murder for hire, the murder of another person for pecuniary gain. Under Alabama law, this charge makes a defendant eligible for the death penalty. During her trial, prosecutors presented the evidence of the murder-for-hire conspiracy, establishing that Lisa had. Bullet operator recruited someone to kill Shay. Bullet operator offered payment for the killing. Bullet operator provided information or access that facilitated the murder. Bullet operator stood to gain financially from Shay's death. The defense attempted to argue that Lisa had not actually intended for Shay to be killed, that perhaps there had been misunderstandings or that she had been coerced by others involved in the plot. But the evidence of her active participation in planning and facilitating her daughter's murder was overwhelming. The jury found Lisa Graham guilty of capital murder. During the penalty phase, they recommended death, and the judge accepted that recommendation. Lisa Marie Graham was sentenced to death and sent to Alabama's death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she remains today. Lisa Graham continues to appeal her conviction and sentence. She has argued that she did not receive adequate legal representation, that the evidence was insufficient to prove beyond reasonable doubt that she intended for Shay to be killed, and that the death penalty is disproportionate punishment in her case. As of 2025, all appeals have been denied. Lisa remains on death row, one of only a handful of women awaiting execution in Alabama. Of all the cases in this documentary, Lisa Graham's may represent the most calculated betrayal. She didn't kill Shay in a moment of rage or temporary insanity. She didn't even commit the act herself in a way that might suggest emotional involvement. Instead, she coldly planned her daughter's murder, recruited someone to carry it out, paid for the killing, and then presumably planned to collect insurance money while mourning her daughter publicly. It's a level of evil that defies comprehension. A mother who could look at her child and see not a person to love and protect, but rather a financial asset to be liquidated for profit. Shay Graham deserved better. She deserved a mother who would protect her, not one who would pay to have her killed. Her life mattered, and her death at her mother's hands represents one of the most profound betrayals imaginable. Case 5. Heather Leavell-Keaton, the stepmother who killed two. The children who vanished. In 2010, a case emerged that would horrify not just Alabama but the entire nation. Two young children, 4-year-old Natalie DeBlaise and her 3-year-old brother Chase DeBlaise, had vanished. Their father, John DeBlaise, and his girlfriend, Heather Leavell-Keaton, claimed the children were staying with relatives. But as concerned family members pressed for answers and law enforcement began investigating, a nightmare emerged that would reveal these children had been tortured, murdered, and their bodies disposed of in different locations. Natalie and Chase DeBlaise were the children of John DeBlaise from a previous relationship. After John separated from the children's biological mother, he gained custody of Natalie and Chase. He began a relationship with Heather Leavell-Keaton, who moved in with John and took on a stepmother role to the children. From the outside, it appeared to be a blended family trying to make things work. But behind closed doors, Heather and John were subjecting Natalie and Chase to horrific abuse that would eventually escalate to murder. In late 2010, family members who hadn't seen Natalie and Chase in months began asking questions about the children's whereabouts. John and Heather provided vague answers. The children were with other relatives, they were staying with friends, they were fine and didn't need to be seen. But one family member was persistent and eventually contacted law enforcement, expressing concerns that something was wrong. Alabama authorities began investigating, and what they uncovered was a nightmare of abuse, torture, and murder. As investigators from the Mobile County Sheriff's Department and the Alabama Bureau of Investigation dug into the case, John and Heather's stories about the children's whereabouts began to fall apart. Phone records, financial records, and witness statements didn't support their claims that the children were with relatives. Under pressure from investigators, John and Heather eventually admitted that both children were dead and led authorities to where they had hidden the bodies. The search spanned 2 states, Alabama and Mississippi, because the couple had disposed of the children's bodies in different locations, apparently hoping to avoid detection. In December of 2010, authorities discovered 4-year-old Natalie's remains in a wooded area in Jackson County, Mississippi. Her small body had been placed in a garbage bag and left in the woods, where it had been for months. Shortly thereafter, 3-year-old Chase's remains were discovered in a wooded area in Mobile County, Alabama. Like his sister, Chase's body had been placed in trash bags and abandoned. The discovery of both children's remains confirmed what family members had feared. Natalie and Chase were dead, victims of abuse at the hands of their father and stepmother. As investigators pieced together what had happened to Natalie and Chase in the months before their deaths, a horrific picture emerged of systematic abuse, torture, and ultimately murder. According to evidence presented at trial and statements made by John during his cooperation with investigators, both children had been subjected to escalating abuse over a period of months. Starvation. Natalie and Chase were deliberately denied adequate food. They were significantly underweight and showed signs of malnutrition. The children were locked in rooms and denied meals as punishment. Physical abuse. Both children were beaten regularly. They had been struck with belts, hands, and other objects. Medical examiners found evidence of old injuries that had healed without medical treatment. Confinement. The children were locked in closets or rooms for extended periods, sometimes overnight or for entire days. Psychological torture. The children were subjected to verbal abuse, told they were worthless, and lived in constant fear of their father and Heather. Both John and Heather participated in the abuse, with each taking turns beating, starving, and tormenting the children. Heather, as the stepmother, was particularly cruel to Natalie and Chase, apparently viewing them as burdens and obstacles to her relationship with John. The exact circumstances of how Natalie and Chase died emerged from John's statements to investigators and from forensic analysis of their remains. While decomposition made determining precise causes of death difficult, evidence suggested both children died from injuries sustained during beatings combined with the effects of prolonged starvation and abuse. According to John's statements, Natalie died first. After a particularly severe beating, she became unresponsive and died. Rather than seeking medical help or reporting her death, John and Heather wrapped her body in garbage bags and drove to Mississippi, where they left her remains in a wooded area. Chase died sometime later, also as a result of abuse. His body was similarly wrapped and discarded in Alabama. The callousness with which John and Heather disposed of these children's bodies, leaving them in woods like trash, demonstrated a complete absence of humanity or parental feeling. Both John DeBlaise and Heather Leavell-Keaton were charged with capital murder in the deaths of Natalie and Chase. Because the murders occurred in different jurisdictions, Chase in Alabama and Natalie in Mississippi, the legal proceedings were complex. John DeBlaise's case. John cooperated with investigators, leading them to the children's remains and providing detailed statements about the abuse and murders. He pleaded guilty to multiple charges and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His cooperation spared him from potential death sentences, but ensured he would never walk free. Heather Leavell-Keaton's case. Heather went to trial in Alabama for the murder of both children. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her participation in the systematic abuse and murder of Natalie and Chase. Bullet operator testimony from John about Heather's role in the abuse. Bullet operator forensic evidence from the crime scenes and the children's remains. Bullet operator statements from witnesses who had seen the children's deteriorating condition. Bullet operator expert testimony about the nature and extent of abuse the children suffered. The jury found Heather guilty of capital murder. During the penalty phase, prosecutors argued that Heather deserved death for her role in torturing and murdering two defenseless children who had been placed in her care. The jury agreed, recommending death. The judge accepted the recommendation and sentenced Heather Leavell-Keaton to death by lethal injection. Heather Leavell-Keaton currently sits on Alabama's death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. She has filed numerous appeals, all of which have been denied. She remains one of only a handful of women on Alabama's death row. John DeBlaise is serving life without parole at an Alabama state prison. He will never be released. Natalie DeBlaise was 4 years old when she died. She loved to color and draw. She was shy but had a beautiful smile. She should have started kindergarten the year after she died. Instead, her body was left in the woods in Mississippi, discarded like garbage by her father and the woman who was supposed to be her stepmother. Chase DeBlaise was 3 years old when he died. He loved trucks and playing outside. He followed his big sister everywhere and looked up to her. He should have grown up, gone to school, made friends, and had a life. Instead, he was tortured and murdered and left in the Alabama woods. Both children are buried together now, in a cemetery in Alabama. Their shared gravestone reads, Natalie DeBlaise, 2006 to 2010, and Chase DeBlaise, 2007 to 2010. Together forever. God's angels. No more pain. The DeBlaise case led to significant reforms in how Alabama tracks missing children and investigates reports of children who suddenly seemed to disappear from their communities. Natalie and Chase's deaths sparked conversations about the vulnerability of children in households with step-parents or parents' romantic partners and the importance of extended families staying involved in children's lives. But no reform can bring back Natalie and Chase. They suffered unimaginable abuse and died in fear and pain, betrayed by the adults who were supposed to protect them. Case 6. Judith Ann Neelley, Alabama's youngest death row inmate. A teenage killer's reign of terror. On September 25, 1982, 13-year-old Lisa Ann Milliken walked out of a Rome, Georgia shopping mall with a young woman who had approached her with a kind smile and an offer of help. Lisa Ann was living in a group home at the time, struggling with the challenges many teenagers face, and she was vulnerable to someone who seemed to offer friendship and assistance. The young woman who approached her was 18-year-old Judith Ann Neelley. And what Lisa Ann thought would be help turned out to be the beginning of a 3-day nightmare of torture, sexual assault, and ultimately murder that would shock the nation and make Judith the youngest woman sentenced to death in United States history. To understand Judith Ann Neelley's crimes, one must understand the toxic relationship she had with her husband, Alvin Neelley. Judith had married Alvin when she was just 15 years old and he was 26, an 11-year age gap that raised questions about manipulation and control. Alvin Neelley was a career criminal with a history of violence, theft, and other crimes. After marrying Judith, the two embarked on a crime spree across the Southeast, committing robberies, abductions, and assaults. Alvin was the dominant partner in the relationship, and Judith later claimed she had been under his complete control, doing whatever he ordered her to do out of fear. But prosecutors would argue, and a jury would agree, that Judith was not simply a victim of Alvin's control. She was an enthusiastic and willing participant in their crimes, including the abduction, torture, and murder of Lisa and Milliken. After Judith approached Lisa and at the Rome, Georgia shopping mall and lured her away, the teenager was taken to a motel in Georgia where both Judith and Alvin held her captive. Over the next 3 days, Lisa Ann endured horrific sexual abuse and torture at the hands of both Judith and Alvin. According to testimony at trial and evidence presented by prosecutors, Judith was not a passive observer during this nightmare. She actively participated in the sexual assault and torture of the 13-year-old girl. She used weapons to intimidate Lisa Ann. She prevented the girl from escaping. She was, in the words of prosecutors, an eager accomplice in the crimes against Lisa Ann. After 3 days of torture, Judith drove Lisa into Little River Canyon in DeKalb County, Alabama, one of the most remote and beautiful natural areas in the state, with deep canyons and waterfalls. But for Lisa and Milliken, it would be the place where her short life ended. On September 28, 1982, Judith Neelley drove Lisa and Milliken to the remote Little River Canyon area. According to Judith's own later statements and evidence presented at trial, she forced Lisa into the edge of the canyon. First, Judith injected Lisa and with liquid drain cleaner, a caustic substance that caused excruciating pain and internal burning. Then, as the 13-year-old girl suffered from this poisoning, Judith shot her multiple times with a handgun. Finally, Judith pushed or threw Lisa Ann's body over the edge of the canyon, sending her tumbling down to the rocks and water below. Whether Lisa Ann was already dead when her body went over the canyon edge, or whether she died from the fall, remains unclear. What is clear is that Judith Neelley deliberately and methodically murdered a 13-year-old girl in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. Lisa Ann's body was discovered days later at the bottom of Little River Canyon by hikers who reported seeing something in the water. The investigation into her death would eventually lead to both Judith and Alvin Neelley. DeKalb County Sheriff's Department investigators and Alabama Bureau of Investigation agents worked tirelessly to identify Lisa Ann's killer. The investigation eventually led them to Judith and Alvin Neelley, who were arrested in connection with Lisa Ann's murder as well as other crimes they had committed during their multi-state crime spree. During interrogation, Judith initially tried to claim she had not participated in Lisa Ann's murder, suggesting Alvin had been solely responsible. But evidence contradicted this claim. Witnesses who had seen Judith and Lisa Ann together placed Judith as the person who had lured Lisa Ann from the mall. Forensic evidence tied Judith to the crime scene. And eventually, faced with overwhelming evidence, Judith admitted her role in the abduction, torture, and murder of Lisa and Milliken. However, Judith maintained that she had acted under Alvin's control, that she had been forced to commit these crimes, and that she was a victim of his abuse and manipulation. This would become the central argument of her defense at trial. Judith Ann Neelley's trial began in Fort Payne, Alabama, in DeKalb County Circuit Court in 1983. The trial attracted national media attention because Judith was just 18 years old at the time of trial and faced the death penalty for the murder of 13-year-old Lisa Ann Milliken. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Richard Agu, presented a methodical case proving Judith's guilt. Evidence of abduction. Witnesses testified about seeing Judith approach and leave with Lisa Ann at the Rome, Georgia Mall. Evidence of captivity and torture. Motel records and witness testimony established that Lisa Ann had been held captive for 3 days, during which she was sexually assaulted and tortured. Evidence of murder. Forensic evidence from the crime scene at Little River Canyon, including ballistics evidence matching the gun used to shoot Lisa and to a weapon possessed by the Neelleys. Judith's statements. Investigators testified about Judith's admissions regarding her role in the crimes. Medical evidence. The medical examiner testified about Lisa Ann's injuries and cause of death. Perhaps most damaging to any claim that Judith had been coerced was evidence that she had acted independently and with enthusiasm during the crimes. Witnesses testified that Judith had appeared in control, had made decisions, and had shown no signs of being under duress. Motel staff who had seen Judith and Alvin during the time Lisa Ann was being held captive reported that Judith seemed like an equal partner with Alvin, not a frightened, controlled victim. The defense, led by attorney Robert French, mounted an aggressive argument that Judith had been under Alvin's complete control due to years of abuse and manipulation. They presented expert testimony on battered woman syndrome. Psychologists testified that Judith exhibited signs of battered woman syndrome and had been psychologically controlled by Alvin. Evidence of Alvin's dominance. Testimony about the 11-year age gap when they married, Alvin's criminal history, and his violent behavior toward Judith. Judith's youth. The defense emphasized that Judith had been just 15 when she married Alvin and was still only 18, legally an adult, but psychologically still developing. But the prosecution effectively countered these arguments by demonstrating that Judith had opportunities to escape Alvin's control, had acted independently during the crimes, and had shown no remorse for her actions. They pointed out that being young and being in a controlling relationship did not excuse torture and murder of an innocent 13-year-old girl. Judith Neelley may have been influenced by Alvin Neelley, prosecutor Agu argued, but she made her own choices. She chose to approach Lisa and Milliken at that mall. She chose to participate in torturing that child for 3 days. She chose to drive Lisa into Little River Canyon. She chose to inject her with drain cleaner. She chose to shoot her. She chose to throw her body over that canyon. At every step, Judith Neelley made choices, and she chose cruelty, torture, and murder. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated and returned a verdict, guilty of capital murder. The conviction meant Judith faced a potential death sentence. During the penalty phase, the jury heard additional testimony about the heinous nature of the crime. The torture of a 13-year-old girl, the cold calculation involved in her murder, the complete lack of mercy shown to Lisa Ann. The defense pleaded for life without parole based on Judith's youth and her claims of being controlled by Alvin. They presented additional expert testimony about her psychological state and argued that executing someone who had been so young when she committed her crimes would be unjust. The jury deliberated on punishment and returned with their recommendation, life without parole. This recommendation, if accepted by the judge, would have meant Judith would spend the rest of her life in prison but would not face execution. At the time of Judith's trial, Alabama law allowed judges to override jury recommendations in capital cases, a practice that has since been abolished. Judge Randall Cole, presiding over Judith's case, exercised this override power. Despite the jury's recommendation of life without parole, Judge Cole sentenced Judith Ann Neelley to death by electrocution, making her the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States at that time. The crime committed by Judith Neelley was so heinous, so atrocious, that I cannot in good conscience sentence her to anything less than death, Judge Cole stated. A 13-year-old child was abducted, tortured for 3 days, injected with poison, shot, and thrown over a canyon. The defendant showed no mercy to Lisa and Milliken, and this court will show none to her. Judith was transported to Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women and placed on death row, where she would remain for the next 17 years. Judith Ann Neelley spent 17 years on death row, becoming one of the longest-serving women awaiting execution in American history. During that time, she exhausted her appeals, all of which were denied. It appeared that Judith would eventually be executed. But in 1999, in one of his final acts as Alabama governor, Fob James made a controversial decision that would outrage victims' advocates and Lisa and Milliken's family. He commuted Judith's death sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Governor James cited several factors in his decision. Bullet operator Judith's extreme youth, 15, when she married Alvin and began the crime spree. Bullet operator questions about whether she had been unduly influenced or controlled by Alvin. Bullet operator, the jury's original recommendation of life without parole, which had been overridden by the judge. Bullet operator, concerns about executing someone for crimes committed when they were 18 years old. The commutation sparked immediate controversy. Lisa Ann's family was devastated and angry, feeling that justice had been denied. Victims' rights advocates protested, arguing that Judith's age did not excuse her crimes and that she should face the punishment a jury and judge had deemed appropriate. District Attorney Richard Agu, who had prosecuted Judith, stated publicly, "This is a travesty of justice. Judith Neelley tortured and murdered a 13-year-old child. She showed no mercy, no remorse, no humanity. The jury convicted her, and a judge sentenced her to death. Governor James has overruled the judicial system and the will of the people. Lisa and Milliken's family has been victimized again." But the commutation stood. Judith's sentence was changed to life without parole, and she was moved from death row to the general prison population. Under the terms of her commuted sentence, Judith became eligible for parole hearings after serving a certain number of years. She has appeared before the Alabama Parole Board multiple times, each time requesting release. At each parole hearing, Lisa and Milliken's family members have appeared to oppose Judith's release, reminding the board of the horrific torture and murder of their 13-year-old relative. The parole board has denied Judith's release every single time. Board members have cited the heinous nature of her crime, the lack of genuine remorse, and the ongoing pain of the victim's family as reasons for denial. Judith Neelley may have been young when she committed these crimes, but that does not diminish the suffering of Lisa and Milliken, one parole board member stated during a hearing. A 13-year-old girl was tortured for 3 days and murdered in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. Judith Neelley can serve out her natural life in prison, which is more mercy than she showed Lisa Ann. Judith Ann Neelley, now in her early 60s, remains incarcerated at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she has been for over 40 years. She is one of the longest-serving female inmates in Alabama's prison system. Prison records indicate Judith has participated in various programs and has maintained a relatively clean disciplinary record during her decades of incarceration. She has expressed remorse for her crimes in recent years, though some question whether this remorse is genuine or strategic. In a letter to the parole board written in 2020, Judith wrote, "I was a child when I met Alvin Neelley, and he controlled every aspect of my life. I did terrible things under his influence, things I can never take back. Lisa and Milliken deserved to live a full life, and I took that from her. I have spent 40 years in prison thinking about what I did, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life." Despite such statements, the parole board has consistently voted to keep Judith imprisoned, and she will face the board again in the future. Alvin Neelley was tried separately for his crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 2005 of natural causes, having never expressed remorse for his crimes. His death meant that Judith could no longer claim she remained under his control or influence, removing one of her arguments for why she committed the crimes. Lisa Ann Milliken was just 13 years old when her life was stolen by Judith and Alvin Neelley. She was a vulnerable teenager who trusted the wrong person and paid the ultimate price. Lisa Ann is buried in Georgia, where her family has maintained her grave for over 40 years. Her gravestone includes a photograph of her smiling face and the inscription, "Lisa Ann Milliken, 1969 to 1982, gone too soon. Forever in our hearts." Lisa Ann's family has become advocates for victims' rights, speaking at parole hearings and pushing for stronger protections for vulnerable children. They have worked to ensure that Lisa Ann's story is not forgotten and that her killer remains imprisoned. Lisa Ann was a sweet girl who had her whole life ahead of her, her aunt stated at a parole hearing. She never got to graduate high school, go to college, get married, have children. She never got to experience any of the joys of adulthood because Judith Neelley tortured her and murdered her. No amount of time in prison can bring Lisa Ann back, but at least keeping Judith locked up ensures she can never hurt another child. Case 7. Kristy Marie Siple, the mother who trafficked her daughter. December 13, 2021. On a December evening in Phoenix City, Alabama, a city of about 37,000 people located right on the Alabama-Georgia border. 5-year-old Kamari Sophronia Renee Holland was reported missing. The little girl, known to family and friends as a bright, cheerful kindergartner, had last been seen at her mother's apartment. The news of a missing 5-year-old sparked an immediate and massive response. Phoenix City Police Department, Russell County Sheriff's Office, Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, and FBI agents descended on the area. Volunteers from the community joined professional searchers in looking for any sign of the little girl. For hours, hope remained that Kamari would be found safe. But as the search continued through the night and into the next day, that hope began to fade. And when Kamari's body was finally discovered in an abandoned house in Phoenix City, the investigation took a dark turn that would reveal one of the most disturbing cases of maternal betrayal in Alabama's recent history. Kamari Holland's body was found in an abandoned house not far from where she had last been seen. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The medical examiner determined she had died from asphyxiation, and the evidence indicated she had suffered tremendously before her death. But as investigators processed the crime scene and began piecing together Kamari's final hours, they uncovered evidence that would shock even the most seasoned detectives. Kamari's own mother, Kristy Marie Siple, had facilitated her daughter's abuse and murder. The investigation quickly identified Jeremy Tremaine Williams as the person who had sexually assaulted and murdered Kamari. Williams was a 37-year-old registered sex offender with a criminal history that included prior convictions for sex crimes against children. Williams was from Georgia but had traveled to Phoenix City on December 13th with the specific purpose of meeting Kamari. And the most horrifying aspect of the case was this. He had been given access to the 5-year-old by her own mother. As investigators examined cell phone records, text messages, social media communications, and financial transactions, a sickening picture emerged. Christie Siple had been in communication with Jeremy Williams and had arranged for him to have access to her 5-year-old daughter. According to evidence presented in court proceedings, communications, text messages between Kristy and Williams showed they had been in contact prior to December 13th, discussing arrangements for Williams to meet Kamari. Financial transactions. Evidence suggested money had changed hands between Williams and Kristy, indicating a financial motive for Kristy's actions. Timeline evidence. Investigators established that Kristy had allowed Williams into her apartment and had given him access to Kamari, knowing his background as a sex offender. Kristy had essentially trafficked her own 5-year-old daughter to a known sexual predator. Whether she knew Williams intended to kill Kamari remains a matter of debate, but she unquestionably knew she was placing her daughter in danger by giving a registered sex offender access to her. The revelation that Kamari had been betrayed by her own mother sent shockwaves through the Phoenix City community and beyond. Vigils were held for Kamari, with hundreds of community members gathering to mourn the loss of the 5-year-old and to express their outrage at the adults who had failed to protect her. Kamari's father, Corey Holland, who had been largely absent from her life, spoke publicly about his grief and guilt. "I should have been more involved," he stated. "I should have protected my baby girl. I failed her, and now she's gone." Kamari's teachers at her elementary school described her as a sweet, energetic child who loved to draw and play with friends. Kamari lit up every room she entered, one teacher said. She was always smiling, always happy. She deserved so much better than what happened to her. Alabama Governor Kay Ivey issued a statement calling Kamari's murder a horrific tragedy and vowing that those responsible would face the full force of Alabama law. Both Jeremy Williams and Kristy Siple were charged in connection with Kamari's death, though with different charges reflecting their different roles in the crime. Jeremy Williams. Williams was charged with capital murder in the death of Kamari Holland. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic evidence placing him at the scene, DNA evidence linking him to the sexual assault, and the timeline established by investigators showing he was with Kamari when she was killed. Williams went to trial in Lee County. Kamari's body was found in Russell County, but legal proceedings were handled in Lee County. The trial was emotionally devastating, with jurors hearing evidence about what Kamari suffered in her final hours. The jury found Williams guilty of capital murder and, during the penalty phase, recommended death. The judge accepted the recommendation and sentenced Jeremy Williams to death by lethal injection. Williams currently sits on Alabama's death row at Holman Correctional Facility, where he will remain until his execution or until he dies of natural causes. Kristy Marie Siple. Kristy was charged with multiple felonies related to her role in facilitating Camry's abuse and death. Bullet operator human trafficking of a child in the first degree. Bullet operator endangering the welfare of a child. Bullet operator child abuse. Bullet operator conspiracy charges. While Kristy was not charged with murder itself, prosecutors determined they could not prove beyond reasonable doubt that she specifically knew Williams intended to kill Camry. Her charges reflected her role in giving a dangerous predator access to her vulnerable 5-year-old daughter. Kristy initially maintained her innocence, claiming she had not known Williams was dangerous and had not facilitated any abuse. But the evidence contradicted these claims. The communications between Kristy and Williams, the financial transactions, and the timeline all proved she had actively arranged for Williams to have access to Camry. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Kristy eventually accepted a plea deal. In August of 2023, she pleaded guilty to human trafficking in the first degree and related charges. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Many people felt that Kristy Siple's 20-year sentence was far too lenient given that her actions directly led to her daughter's sexual assault and murder. Victims' advocates, members of Camry's extended family, and community members expressed outrage that Kristy might someday walk free. Kristy Siple sold her daughter to a monster, one victim's advocate stated. She knew what she was doing. She knew Williams was a sex offender. She gave him access to a 5-year-old child in exchange for money. And Camry died because of it. 20 years is not enough. Lee County District Attorney Brandon Hughes defended the sentence, explaining that proving Kristy knew Williams would kill Camry was difficult without direct evidence of that knowledge. We charged Kristy with the crimes we could prove beyond reasonable doubt, Hughes stated. Human trafficking in the first degree carries a significant sentence, and Kristy will spend many years in prison for her role in this tragedy. Under Alabama law, Kristy will have to serve a substantial portion of her 20-year sentence before being eligible for parole. She will be in her 50s before she could potentially be released. Camry Sophronia Renee Holland was just 5 years old when her life was stolen. She was in kindergarten, learning to read, making friends, discovering the world. She loved art and music. She loved playing outside. She had dreams of what she wanted to be when she grew up. All of that potential, all of those dreams, were destroyed because her mother valued money more than she valued Camry's safety and life. Camry is buried in Alabama. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of community members who never knew her in life but wanted to honor her in death. Her small white casket was covered in pink flowers, her favorite color. Her gravestone reads, Camry Sophronia Renee Holland. October 15, 2016 to December 13, 2021. Heaven's Littlest Princess. Gone but never forgotten. Camry's murder prompted legislative action in Alabama. State lawmakers introduced Camry's Law, which included several provisions. Bullet operator enhanced penalties for parents who traffic their own children. Bullet operator mandatory reporting requirements for anyone who suspects a child is being trafficked. Bullet operator additional resources for investigating child trafficking cases. Bullet operator stronger monitoring of registered sex offenders. Bullet operator educational programs to raise awareness about familial trafficking. The legislation was signed into law in 2022, with lawmakers dedicating it to Camry's memory. No child should ever suffer what Camry suffered, one legislator stated during the signing ceremony. We cannot bring Camry back, but we can work to ensure that other children are better protected from the kind of evil that took her life. Kristy Marie Siple is currently incarcerated at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, serving her 20-year sentence. According to prison records, she has been placed in protective custody due to threats from other inmates. Prisoners who harm children, especially mothers who betray their own children, are universally despised in the prison population. Prison sources indicate Kristy has expressed remorse for her actions, though many question whether this remorse is genuine or simply an attempt to improve her chances at parole when she becomes eligible. Jeremy Tremaine Williams remains on death row at Holman Correctional Facility. His appeals are ongoing, but legal experts believe his execution will eventually be carried out given the overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the heinous nature of his crime. For Kamari Holland, there is no appeal, no second chance, no future. Her life ended at 5 years old because her mother made a choice to value money over her daughter's safety. It is a betrayal that defies comprehension and a crime that will never be forgotten in the Phoenix City community. Case 8. Rhonda Carlson, the conspirator in family annihilation. February 24, 2015. In Madison County, Alabama, on a cold February day, law enforcement responded to a report of shots fired at a residence. What they discovered would expose a deadly conspiracy between a husband and his new wife to eliminate his previous family and start fresh. Kristen Smallwood, a young woman who was 7 months pregnant with her second child, had been shot and killed. The unborn baby she was carrying also died. The investigation would reveal that Kristen's estranged husband, Christopher Carlson, and his new wife, Rhonda Carlson, had conspired to murder Kristen so they could be together without the complications of Christopher's previous relationship. Kristen Smallwood was a young mother in her 20s who was looking forward to expanding her family. She was 7 months pregnant and preparing for the arrival of her baby. She had one older child from her relationship with Christopher Carlson, and despite their separation, she was trying to co-parent and move forward with her life. Kristen worked at a local business and was described by friends and co-workers as kind, hardworking, and excited about becoming a mother again. She had dreams for her future and her children's futures. She was planning the nursery for the new baby and looking forward to holding her child in her arms. The unborn baby, who would have been born healthy in just 2 months, never got the chance to take a first breath or be held by a loving mother. Both Kristen and her unborn child lost their lives because Christopher and Rhonda decided they were obstacles to be eliminated. Christopher Carlson had been married to Kristen, but their relationship had deteriorated and they had separated. Christopher began a relationship with Rhonda, and the two eventually married. But Christopher's connection to Kristen through their child, and Kristen's pregnancy with another of Christopher's children, created what Christopher and Rhonda apparently viewed as an unwanted complication in their lives. According to evidence presented at trial, rather than simply going through the legal processes of divorce and custody arrangements like millions of separated couples do, Christopher and Rhonda began discussing eliminating Kristen permanently. Investigators found evidence of communications between Christopher and Rhonda in which they discussed their desire to be free of Kristen. Text messages, phone calls, and other communications painted a picture of two people planning murder so they could have the life they wanted without Christopher's ex-wife and children as part of the picture. On February 24, 2015, the conspiracy was carried out. Kristen Smallwood was shot and killed. She was 7 months pregnant at the time, and the unborn baby died along with her. The investigation revealed that Christopher Carlson was the shooter, but that Rhonda had been actively involved in planning the murder and was present or nearby when it occurred. Evidence showed this was not a spontaneous act of violence, but rather a premeditated murder that had been discussed and planned. When law enforcement arrived at the scene and began investigating, the web of conspiracy began to unravel. Physical evidence, witness statements, and the communications between Christopher and Rhonda all pointed to their guilt. Both Christopher and Rhonda Carlson were charged with capital murder, the murder of Kristen Smallwood and her unborn child. In Alabama, the murder of a pregnant woman that results in the death of her unborn child can be charged as a double homicide, reflecting the loss of 2 lives. Christopher Carlson's case, as the shooter and the person with the direct motive to eliminate his ex-wife, Christopher faced overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He eventually pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rhonda Carlson's case. Rhonda went to trial, fighting the charges against her. The prosecution presented evidence of the conspiracy. Bullet operator communications between Rhonda and Christopher discussing their desire to be rid of Kristen. Bullet operator evidence that Rhonda knew about and supported the plan to kill Kristen. Bullet operator testimony establishing Rhonda's presence and involvement on the day of the murder. Bullet operator expert testimony about conspiracy and accomplice liability. The defense argued that Rhonda had not actually pulled the trigger and therefore should not be held responsible for Kristen's death. They attempted to suggest that Christopher had acted alone and that Rhonda had been unaware of his intentions. But the prosecution successfully demonstrated that under Alabama law, a person who conspires to commit murder and takes substantial steps to facilitate that murder is equally guilty, even if they don't personally commit the act. Rhonda's communications with Christopher, her involvement in planning, and her presence during or near the time of the murder made her an accomplice to capital murder. The jury found Rhonda Carlson guilty of capital murder. During the sentencing phase, the jury recommended life without parole rather than death. The judge accepted the recommendation. Rhonda Carlson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for her role in the conspiracy to murder Kristen Smallwood and her unborn baby. Both Christopher and Rhonda Carlson are currently serving life sentences without parole in Alabama state prisons. They will never walk free again. Christopher is incarcerated at a men's facility, where he will spend the rest of his life contemplating the fact that he murdered the mother of his children and his unborn baby. Rhonda is incarcerated at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. Prison records indicate she has filed appeals arguing that her sentence was too harsh given that she did not personally pull the trigger, but all appeals have been denied. Courts have consistently ruled that her active participation in the conspiracy made her equally culpable for the murders. Christopher and Kristen's older child, who was just a toddler at the time of Kristen's murder, has been raised by Kristen's family. That child will grow up knowing that their father murdered their mother while their mother was pregnant with their sibling, and that their father's new wife helped plan the murder. The psychological burden this child will carry is immense. They lost their mother to violence, their father to prison, and a sibling who was never born. Family members who are raising the child have ensured they receive counseling and support to help them process this trauma. Kristen Smallwood was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was a mother to one child and was preparing to welcome another. She had dreams, goals, and people who loved her. She deserved to live, to raise her children, to watch them grow up. The baby she was carrying, who would have been born in April of 2015, never got to experience life outside the womb. That baby never took a breath, never opened their eyes, never felt the warmth of their mother's embrace. Both are buried together in a Madison County cemetery. The shared grave is marked with a stone that reads, Kristen Smallwood and Baby. February 24, 2015. Together in heaven. Gone too soon. Forever in our hearts. Kristen's family holds a memorial service each year on the anniversary of her death, celebrating her life and the life of the baby that never was. They keep Kristen's memory alive for her surviving child, ensuring that child knows their mother loved them and that their mother's death was not their fault. Kristen was a loving mother who would have done anything for her children, Kristen's mother stated. She was murdered by the man she once loved and the woman who helped him. They took away my daughter and my unborn grandchild. They destroyed our family. But we won't let Kristen be forgotten. We will make sure her child knows who their mother was and how much she loved them. Case 9. Angelica Quintana, the mother who killed in front of her children. August 14, 2022. On a summer day in Lawrence County, Alabama, a domestic dispute escalated into murder, and two young children watched as their mother deliberately killed their father. Angelica Quintana used her vehicle as a weapon, running over Dennis Melton with lethal force while their children, ages 3 and 7, witnessed the horrific act. The case represents not just the murder of Dennis Melton, but also the traumatization of two children who saw their mother kill their father, a trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives. Angelica Quintana and Dennis Melton had been in an on-again, off-again relationship for years. They had two children together, but had never married. By all accounts, their relationship was tumultuous, marked by arguments, separations, and reconciliations. Friends and family members of both Angelica and Dennis reported that the couple had a volatile dynamic. There had been previous altercations, yelling matches, and periods where they would break up only to get back together weeks or months later. In August of 2022, the relationship was once again strained. Dennis and Angelica had been arguing about custody arrangements, finances, and other issues related to co-parenting their two children. But on August 14th, those arguments would escalate into fatal violence. On the afternoon of August 14th, 2022, Angelica and Dennis were involved in a heated argument. The specific details of what sparked the argument remain unclear, but witnesses reported hearing yelling and seeing the couple in a confrontation. The two children, ages 7 and 3, were present during the argument. They watched as their parents fought, not knowing they were about to witness something that would haunt them forever. According to witness testimony and evidence presented at trial, during the argument, Angelica got into her vehicle. Dennis was standing near the vehicle. Rather than driving away to cool down or de-escalate the situation, Angelica made a deadly choice. She deliberately drove her vehicle into Dennis, striking him with fatal force. The impact threw Dennis to the ground, where he sustained catastrophic injuries. Angelica's vehicle rolled over him, causing additional trauma. The 7-year-old and 3-year-old children watched in horror as their mother deliberately used her vehicle to run over their father. Witnesses reported hearing the children screaming. The oldest child reportedly ran toward Dennis, trying to help him, while the youngest child stood frozen in shock. Emergency services were called immediately by witnesses who had seen the incident. Lawrence County Sheriff's Department deputies and paramedics arrived within minutes, but Dennis Melton was already deceased. The force of the impact and the injuries he sustained were immediately fatal. Angelica remained at the scene. According to witnesses, she appeared stunned by what she had done, but made no attempt to help Dennis or to comfort her traumatized children. She was immediately taken into custody by law enforcement. The most heartbreaking aspect of this case is the profound trauma inflicted on the two children who witnessed their mother murder their father. Mental health professionals who later evaluated the children described them as suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from what they had witnessed. The 7-year-old, who was old enough to fully understand what had happened, developed nightmares, anxiety, and behavioral problems. The child became withdrawn, stopped playing with friends, and struggled in school. In therapy sessions, the child repeatedly asked questions like, "Why did mommy hurt daddy? And was it my fault?" The 3-year-old, while too young to fully comprehend the permanence of death, exhibited regression behaviors, bedwetting, clinging to caregivers, and extreme fear of vehicles. The child would scream and panic whenever placed in a car, having associated vehicles with the trauma of watching their father die. Child psychologists involved in the case noted that witnessing parental domestic violence, particularly murder, causes some of the most severe psychological trauma a child can experience. These children lost both parents in one horrific moment, one to death and one to prison, and witnessed violence that no child should ever see. These children will carry this trauma for the rest of their lives. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a child psychologist who treated both children, testified at trial. They watched their mother kill their father. That image will never leave them. They will need years of intensive therapy, and even then, they may struggle with trust, attachment, and relationships for their entire lives. The psychological damage Angelica Quintana inflicted on her own children cannot be overstated. Lawrence County Sheriff's Department investigators quickly determined that Dennis Melton's death was not an accident. Multiple witnesses had seen the incident and confirmed that Angelica had deliberately driven her vehicle into Dennis. Physical evidence at the scene supported witness accounts. Tire marks and the position of Dennis's body indicated he had been struck intentionally. Forensic accident reconstructionists testified that the angle and speed of impact were consistent with deliberate action, not an accident. Investigators also examined Angelica's vehicle and found no mechanical problems that could have caused an accidental acceleration or loss of control. The vehicle was in good working order, and all systems were functioning normally. Angelica herself made statements to investigators admitting that she had driven her vehicle into Dennis. While she initially claimed it was an accident, her story changed multiple times, and eventually, she acknowledged that she had been angry and had wanted to hurt him. The evidence was clear. Angelica Quintana had committed murder using her vehicle as a weapon. Angelica Quintana's trial for murder began in Lawrence County Circuit Court in late 2023. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Eric Jett, presented a straightforward case of murder committed during a domestic dispute. The evidence. Witness testimony. Multiple witnesses testified about seeing Angelica deliberately drive her vehicle into Dennis. Their accounts were consistent and credible. The children's testimony. The 7-year-old child provided testimony through a forensic interviewer, describing what they had witnessed. The child's testimony was heartbreaking and provided powerful evidence of Angelica's actions. Forensic evidence. Accident reconstruction experts testified about the physical evidence, explaining why this was clearly an intentional act rather than an accident. Angelica's statements. Investigators testified about Angelica's changing stories and her eventual admission that she had been angry and wanted to hurt Dennis. Medical evidence. The medical examiner testified about Dennis's injuries and explained that the force of impact was substantial and unsurvivable. The defense, led by attorney Marcus Thompson, attempted to argue several theories. Self-defense. The defense claimed Angelica had been afraid of Dennis and had acted to protect herself. However, this argument was undermined by the fact that Dennis was not in the vehicle with Angelica and was not threatening her at the moment she drove into him. Accident. The defense suggested the incident might have been an accident, that Angelica had intended to drive away but had accidentally accelerated into Dennis. But forensic evidence and witness testimony contradicted this claim. Heat of passion. The defense argued that Angelica had acted in the heat of passion during a heated argument and therefore should be convicted of a lesser charge than murder. The prosecution countered that getting into a vehicle, starting it, and deliberately driving it into someone requires enough time for reflection that it cannot be considered a purely impulsive act. The jury heard all the evidence and deliberated for approximately 8 hours before returning their verdict, guilty of murder. During the sentencing phase of the trial, the prosecution presented victim impact statements from Dennis Melton's family and from the guardian ad litem representing the 2 children. Dennis's mother testified about the son she lost and the grandchildren who would grow up without their father. Dennis wasn't perfect, she testified, tears streaming down her face. He and Angelica had their problems, but he loved his children more than anything. He was working to be a better father to them, and Angelica took him away from them in the most horrific way possible. Those babies watched their father die. They will never be the same. The guardian ad litem for the children provided a statement describing the ongoing trauma the children were experiencing and the long-term impact of witnessing their father's murder. These children have been sentenced to a lifetime of trauma, the statement read. They will struggle with what they witnessed for years to come. They have lost both parents and their sense of safety and security. The defendant's actions on August 14th destroyed not just Dennis Melton's life, but her own children's childhoods. The defense presented mitigating evidence, including testimony about Angelica's difficult upbringing, evidence of previous domestic disputes in the relationship, and arguments that Angelica deserved a chance at eventual rehabilitation. On January 12, 2025, Lawrence County Circuit Court Judge Robert Sherling sentenced Angelica Quintana to life in prison for the murder of Dennis Melton. Under Alabama's sentencing guidelines for murder, Angelica will have to serve a significant portion of her sentence before becoming eligible for parole consideration. Legal experts estimate she will spend at least 30 years in prison before any possibility of release. Ms. Quintana, you committed murder in front of your own children, Judge Sherling stated during sentencing. Your children watched as you deliberately drove your vehicle into their father, killing him before their eyes. You have traumatized your children in ways that will affect them for the rest of their lives. You have taken away their father and, through your own actions, removed yourself from their lives as well. You will spend the rest of your life, or a substantial portion of it, in prison, and that is exactly what you deserve. Angelica Quintana is currently incarcerated at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she is serving her life sentence. According to prison records, she has been a compliant inmate with no major disciplinary issues. Prison sources indicate that Angelica has participated in counseling programs and has expressed remorse for her actions, particularly for the trauma she inflicted on her children by killing their father in front of them. In letters to the prison chaplain, which have been shared with court officials, Angelica has written, "I destroyed my children's lives. They watched me kill their father. I can never take that back. I think about them every day and wonder if they will ever be able to forgive me or if they will spend their whole lives hating me for what I did." Whether the children will ever seek contact with Angelica remains to be seen. Currently, they are being raised by Dennis's family and are receiving intensive therapy to help them process their trauma. Dennis Melton's children are now 8 and 4 years old, being raised by their paternal grandmother in a different Alabama county, far from the scene of their trauma. Both continue to receive regular therapy, and their grandmother has stated that they are slowly beginning to heal, though the road is long. The older child, now 8, has begun asking questions about why the incident happened and whether they could have prevented it. Common questions for children who witness violence. Therapists are working to help the child understand that they bear no responsibility for what happened and that what their mother did was wrong. The younger child, now 4, has limited conscious memory of the event but continues to exhibit trauma responses, including fear of vehicles and separation anxiety. These children are survivors, their grandmother stated in an interview. They've been through something no child should ever experience. But they're strong, and they're getting the help they need. We talk about their father, keep his memory alive for them, and we're honest with them about what happened in age-appropriate ways. Dennis would want his children to grow up healthy and happy, and that's what we're working toward every day. Dennis Melton was 32 years old when he died. He worked in construction and was described by friends and co-workers as hardworking and dedicated to his children. While his relationship with Angelica had been troubled, those who knew him said he was actively trying to be a good father to his kids. Dennis is buried in Lawrence County. His gravestone reads, Dennis Ray Melton, May 15, 1990 to August 14, 2022. Devoted father. Gone too soon. Forever watching over your children. His mother maintains his grave, bringing flowers regularly and bringing the children to visit so they can remember their father. She has created memory books for each child filled with photos of Dennis, stories about him, and letters he wrote to them when they were babies. My son made mistakes, but he didn't deserve to die, Dennis's mother has stated. And his children didn't deserve to watch him die. Angelica took away their father in the worst way possible. But we're making sure Dennis's children know he loved them and that his memory lives on. Case 10, Yowrick Pride, the beating death of Caden Garner. October 5, 2020. In Mobile, Alabama, on a fall day in 2020, emergency services received a frantic call about a 3-year-old child who was unresponsive and not breathing. When Mobile Fire Rescue Department paramedics arrived at the apartment, they found 3-year-old Caden Garner suffering from catastrophic injuries that would prove fatal. The toddler had been beaten so severely that his small body could not survive the trauma. And the person responsible for inflicting those injuries was not his biological mother, but rather his father's girlfriend, Yowrick Pride, who had been caring for Caden at the time of the fatal assault. Caden Garner was born in 2017 in Mobile, Alabama. He was a happy, energetic toddler who loved playing with trucks and spending time with his father. Like all 3-year-olds, Caden was developing his personality, learning new words every day, and exploring the world around him with the natural curiosity of childhood. Caden's parents were not together, and his father had primary custody. When Caden's father began dating Yowrick Pride, she became a regular presence in Caden's life, often caring for him when his father was at work. But rather than providing the care and protection a 3-year-old needs, Yowrick would ultimately take Caden's life in an explosion of violence that shocked the Mobile community. On October 5, 2020, Caden was in the care of Yowrick Pride while his father was at work. According to the timeline established by investigators, at some point during the day, Yowrick subjected Caden to a violent beating that proved fatal. The exact trigger for the violence remains unclear. During the investigation and trial, Yowrick claimed that Caden had been misbehaving and that she had been attempting to discipline him. But the severity of Caden's injuries far exceeded any reasonable definition of discipline. This was a brutal assault on a defenseless 3-year-old child. According to medical evidence, Caden was struck repeatedly with extreme force. He sustained blunt force trauma to his head, torso, and extremities. The injuries were so severe that they caused internal bleeding and organ damage. A 3-year-old child's body is small and fragile, and Caden's body could not withstand the violence inflicted upon him. When Yowrick finally called for emergency help, it was too late. Paramedics arrived and attempted to resuscitate Caden, but his injuries were unsurvivable. He was transported to University of South Alabama Children's and Women's Hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Dr. Mark Leavell, the forensic pathologist who performed Caden's autopsy, documented injuries that could only have resulted from deliberate, forceful assault. His testimony at trial was difficult for everyone in the courtroom to hear. Caden had suffered blunt force trauma to his head, causing brain bleeding and swelling. He had injuries to his torso consistent with being struck or kicked with significant force. He had bruises, lacerations, and evidence of internal injuries. This child was beaten to death, Dr. Leavell testified. The injuries I documented required substantial force that far exceeds anything that could be called discipline or that could occur accidentally. Someone beat this 3-year-old child with enough force to cause fatal internal injuries. This was not discipline gone wrong. This was assault resulting in death. The medical examiner also noted that some of Caden's injuries appeared to be in different stages of healing, suggesting this may not have been the first time he had been struck or injured while in Yowrick's care. Mobile Police Department detectives conducted extensive interviews with Yowrick Pride in the hours following Caden's death. Her statements were inconsistent and evolved as investigators presented her with evidence contradicting her claims. Initially, Yowrick claimed that Caden had fallen or had hurt himself while playing, and she had simply found him injured. But the nature and severity of Caden's injuries made this explanation impossible. A 3-year-old does not sustain the kind of injuries Caden had from a simple fall or accident. When confronted with the medical evidence, Yowrick changed her story. She admitted that she had been disciplining Caden for misbehavior, but claimed she had not intended to seriously hurt him. She said she had lost her temper and had struck Caden multiple times, but insisted she hadn't realized how badly he was hurt until he became unresponsive. Investigators didn't believe Yowrick's minimization of her actions. The severity and pattern of injuries suggested sustained, deliberate violence, not a momentary loss of control. Caden had been beaten repeatedly with enough force to cause fatal injuries. This was not accidental or a single blow that went wrong. This was a sustained assault on a 3-year-old child. Yowrick Pride was charged with felony murder in the death of Caden Garner. Under Alabama law, felony murder occurs when a person kills another person during the commission of a felony. In this case, aggravated child abuse. The felony murder charge recognized that while Yowrick may not have specifically intended to kill Caden, her act of severely beating him, which constituted felony child abuse, resulted in his death. Under felony murder doctrine, if someone commits a felony and a death results from that felony, they can be charged with murder regardless of whether they specifically intended to kill. The charge sent a clear message: beating a child to death, even if framed as discipline, is murder. Yowrick Pride's trial took place in Mobile County Circuit Court. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Wright, presented a methodical case proving Yowrick's guilt. The evidence presented: medical testimony, Dr. Leavell's detailed testimony about Caden's injuries and the force required to inflict them. Timeline evidence. Investigators established that Caden had been healthy when his father left for work and was fatally injured while in Yowrick's sole care, proving she was responsible for his death. Yowrick's statements. Investigators testified about Yowrick's changing stories and her eventual admission that she had struck Caden multiple times. Expert testimony on child abuse. Child abuse experts testified about the difference between appropriate discipline and abuse, and explained that Caden's injuries were far beyond anything that could be considered discipline. Character evidence. Witnesses testified about Yowrick's short temper and previous incidents where she had been rough with Caden. The defense, led by attorney David Johnson, attempted to argue that Yowrick had not intended to kill Caden and that her actions, while wrong, did not rise to the level of murder. They argued for a lesser charge of manslaughter, suggesting that Yowrick had used excessive force during discipline but had not intended to cause Caden's death. But the prosecution successfully countered that under felony murder statutes, intent to kill was not required. Yowrick had committed felony child abuse by beating Caden severely enough to cause fatal injuries, and under Alabama law, that made her guilty of murder. Yowrick Pride beat a 3-year-old child to death, Prosecutor Wright argued in her closing statement. She can claim she didn't mean to kill him, that she just wanted to discipline him. But the law is clear. When you commit a violent felony against a child and that child dies, you are guilty of murder. Caden Garner is dead because Yowrick Pride chose to beat him instead of caring for him. That is murder. After a 2-week trial, the jury deliberated for approximately 6 hours before returning their verdict: guilty of felony murder in the death of Caden Garner. The conviction carried a sentence range of 20 years to life in prison. During the sentencing hearing, Mobile County Circuit Court Judge Ben Brooks heard victim impact statements from Caden's family. Caden's father, who had entrusted his son's care to Yowrick, testified through tears about his guilt and grief. I trusted her with my son, he said. I thought she would take care of him while I was at work. Instead, she killed him. I will never forgive myself for leaving Caden with her. I will never forgive her for what she did to my baby boy. Caden's maternal grandmother testified about the hole Caden's death left in their family. Caden was just starting to really talk and develop his personality, she said. He was such a happy little boy. He had his whole life ahead of him. And Yowrick Pride beat him to death because he was acting like a normal 3-year-old child. She deserves to spend the rest of her life in prison for what she did. Judge Brooks sentenced Yowrick Pride to a substantial prison term for felony murder. While the exact length of her sentence has not been publicly disclosed in all sources, court records indicate she received a lengthy sentence that will keep her imprisoned for decades. Ms. Pride, you were entrusted with the care of a 3-year-old child, and you beat him to death, Judge Brooks stated during sentencing. You can claim you were disciplining him, but the evidence shows you subjected Caden Garner to a brutal beating that caused fatal injuries. A 3-year-old child is dead because you chose violence over care. You have destroyed a family and taken an innocent life. You will spend many years in prison for your crime. Yowrick Pride is currently incarcerated in the Alabama prison system, serving her sentence for the murder of 3-year-old Caden Garner. According to prison records, she has maintained a relatively low profile during her incarceration. She has filed appeals arguing that her sentence was too harsh and that she should have been convicted of a lesser charge than murder. All appeals have been denied, with courts ruling that the evidence supported the felony murder conviction and that her sentence was appropriate given the death of a child in her care. Caden's father has struggled with intense guilt since his son's death. In interviews with local media, he has spoken about the anguish of having trusted Yowrick with his son's care and the horror of learning what she had done. Every day I wake up and think about Caden, he said in one interview. Every day I ask myself why I didn't see warning signs, why I didn't realize Yowrick might hurt him. I trusted her, and that trust cost my son his life. I have to live with that guilt forever. The father has become an advocate for more careful screening of caregivers and for educating parents about signs of child abuse. He has spoken at community events about Caden's case, hoping to prevent other children from suffering similar fates. If my son's death can save even one other child, then some tiny bit of good will have come from this tragedy, he has stated. I want parents to really know the people they're leaving their children with. Watch for warning signs. Trust your instincts. Don't let what happened to Caden happen to your child. Caden Garner was just 3 years old when his life ended in violence. He loved trucks and dinosaurs. He was learning to count and to sing songs. He had a smile that lit up every room. He deserved to grow up, to go to school, to make friends, to experience all the joys of childhood and beyond. Caden is buried in Mobile. His small grave is marked with a headstone featuring a carved teddy bear and toy truck. The inscription reads, Caden Elijah Garner. June 3, 2017 to October 5, 2020. Heaven's littlest superhero. Forever 3. Forever loved. In Daddy's heart always. His father visits the grave regularly, bringing toy trucks and talking to Caden about his day. It's a ritual of grief and love that will continue for the rest of his life. Caden's case highlighted the particular vulnerability of children in households where parental figures' romantic partners assume caregiving responsibilities. While many step-parents and parents' partners provide loving care to children, cases like Caden's remind us of the importance of carefully vetting anyone who will have unsupervised access to vulnerable children. We have journeyed through 10 verified cases of women in Alabama who committed the unthinkable, mothers and maternal figures who murdered, abused, trafficked, or conspired to kill children who should have been safe in their care. Christie Michelle Scott drugged her 6-year-old son and set fire to their home to collect insurance money, leaving Mason to die in flames. Patricia Blackmon beat her 2-year-old adopted daughter to death, betraying the trust placed in her as an adoptive mother. Tierra Gobble violently shook and struck her 4-month-old son, ending Phoenix's life before it had barely begun. Lisa Marie Graham hired someone to murder her teenage daughter Shay, orchestrating death from a distance. Heather Leavell-Keaton participated in the torture and murder of her stepchildren, 4-year-old Natalie and 3-year-old Chase. Judith Ann Neelley abducted, tortured, and murdered 13-year-old Lisa and Milliken in one of Alabama's most notorious crimes. Kristy Marie Siple trafficked her 5-year-old daughter Camari to a sexual predator who murdered her. Rhonda Carlson conspired with her husband to murder his pregnant ex-wife and unborn baby. Angelica Quintana deliberately ran over the father of her children while those children watched. Yowrick Pride beat her boyfriend's 3-year-old son to death in what she claimed was discipline. These cases force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Mothers can be monsters. The cultural narrative tells us that maternal love is instinctive, universal, and unconditional. We want to believe that all women who give birth or take on parenting roles naturally love and protect children. But these 10 cases prove that biology does not guarantee love, and assuming a parental role does not make someone a good parent. Some women, whether due to mental illness, addiction, selfishness, greed, or pure evil, harm the children they should protect. Acknowledging this reality is not about demonizing mothers or women. The vast majority of mothers are loving, protective, and would literally die to save their children. But denying that maternal evil exists makes us less able to identify and stop it when it occurs. In reviewing these 10 cases, a pattern emerges. In almost every case, there were warning signs that were noticed but not acted upon. Bullet operator neighbors heard children screaming but didn't call authorities. Bullet operator teachers saw bruises or neglect but accepted parents' explanations. Bullet operator family members noticed concerning behavior but didn't intervene. Bullet operator medical professionals had suspicions but didn't follow up aggressively enough. Bullet operator child protective services received reports but conducted inadequate investigations. These failures didn't cause the murders, but they represent missed opportunities to save children's lives. We as a society must do better at recognizing warning signs and acting on them, even when it's uncomfortable or uncertain. If these horrific cases teach us anything, it's that protecting children requires vigilance from everyone. For individuals, bullet operator learned the warning signs of child abuse and neglect. Bullet operator report suspected abuse to authorities. Always err on the side of caution. Bullet operator support struggling parents in your community before they reach crisis points. Bullet operator stay involved in children's lives. Isolation makes abuse easier. Bullet operator trust your instincts when something seems wrong. As we close this documentary, we must remember that this story is not really about the 10 women who committed these crimes. This story is about the children. Mason Scott, who loved dinosaurs and dreamed of being a paleontologist. Dominiqua Bryant, who deserved a loving adoptive family but found torture instead. Phoenix Parrish, who lived only 16 weeks before his life was stolen. Shay Graham, whose mother valued her death more than her life. Natalie and Chase DeBlaise, who suffered unimaginable abuse before their deaths. Lisa and Milliken, a vulnerable teenager who trusted the wrong person. Kamari Holland, a kindergartner whose mother betrayed her to a predator. Kristen Smallwood and her unborn baby, murdered so a man could start a new life. Dennis Melton, killed in front of his traumatized children. Caden Garner, beaten to death by the woman caring for him. These are the names we must remember. These are the lives that mattered. These are the victims who deserved so much better than they received. If you take nothing else from this documentary, take this. Every child deserves protection, and every adult has a role to play in providing it. This has been one of the most difficult documentaries Cold Case Time has ever produced. The research was emotionally exhausting. The stories were heartbreaking. Writing about the suffering of innocent children was almost unbearable. But these stories must be told. These children must be remembered. These women's crimes must be exposed and documented so we can learn from them and hopefully prevent future tragedies. The 10 women in this documentary are behind bars in Alabama prisons. Some await execution on death row. Others will die in prison of natural causes. None will ever walk free again. But more importantly, children's lives were stolen. Families were destroyed. Communities were traumatized. And we, as a society, must commit to doing better, to being more vigilant, more willing to intervene, more supportive of struggling families, and more protective of vulnerable children. Evil exists. It exists in Alabama. It exists in quiet neighborhoods. It exists, sometimes, in the hearts of mothers who should love but instead destroy. But good exists too. In the investigators who work tirelessly to find justice for victims. In the prosecutors who ensure criminals are held accountable. In the foster families who open their homes to traumatized children. In the therapists who help survivors heal. in the communities that rally around victims' families, in every person who reports abuse, who supports a struggling parent, who stays involved in a child's life. We cannot bring back the children we lost, but we can honor their memories by protecting the children who are still here. This has been Cold Case Time. Thank you for having the strength to watch this difficult but important documentary. If this content impacted you, please like this video to help it reach more people who care about child safety. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or telling us which case affected you most deeply. And please subscribe to Cold Case Time and hit that notification bell so you never miss our thoroughly researched, verified true crime documentaries. Share this video with others who care about protecting children and seeking justice for victims. The more people who understand the reality of child abuse and maternal evil, the better equipped we are as a society to prevent these tragedies. Remember, silence protects perpetrators. Speaking up saves lives. If you see something, say something. Every child deserves an advocate. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and never stop fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves.